It all began when I moved into my dream home, a beautiful house with a long, scenic driveway leading up to my garage. This driveway is unnecessarily long, and frankly, it's an eyesore. Her smirk widened. At first, I didn't take her seriously. The fine? That's interesting, because I have the property deed inside, and it says otherwise. Her eye twitched. For the next week, I kept finding fresh notices in my mailbox. Remove excess pavement. Shorten driveway to HOA standards. Each one was more absurd than the last. Meanwhile, Margaret ramped up her tactics. Then she tried to fine me for unauthorized construction because I had resealed part of my driveway. Then one morning, I walked outside and saw something that made my blood boil. Margaret had put up a sign at the end of my driveway. Future site of HOA green space. Community improvement project, pending approval. I stared at it, read it again, laughed, then took out my phone and snapped a picture. Margaret was trying to take my land, and she had no idea what she had just started. I let out a slow breath, my hands clenching into fists. If this was Margaret's idea of intimidation, she had severely underestimated my patience. I wasn't about to let some clipboard-wielding tyrant dictate what I could and couldn't do with my own land. I took a chair, set it right in front of the sign, and made myself comfortable with a fresh cup of coffee. If Margaret wanted a war, I was more than willing to play along. It didn't take long for her to appear. She came to a stop just a few feet away, hands on her hips, waiting for me to acknowledge her. I sipped my coffee. Nice day for a public land grab, huh? She let out an exaggerated sigh. This isn't personal, you know. It's about the community. We're trying to create a more uniform and appealing aesthetic. I nodded slowly. So, just so we're clear, you want to take my driveway, which, by the way, is completely on my property, and turn it into a public space. Margaret smiled, as if she had just explained something simple to a child. We all have to make sacrifices for the greater good. I chuckled. Right. Except I didn't agree to be part of the HOA. She waved a hand dismissively. That's just a minor clerical issue. Pretty big clerical issue when you're trying to take my land. I shot back. Margaret's eyes flashed with impatience. It's not your land if the community decides it's better suited for public use. I nearly choked on my coffee. Well, so if the community suddenly decides your house would make a great dog park, that's fair game too. Her expression darkened. That's not how it works. Sure seems like it is, I said. She exhaled sharply and pulled out a folder. Let's talk about something else. Come again. She gestured toward my driveway, where my perfectly normal, well-maintained vehicle sat parked. It's an eyesore. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. My car? Yes, it's not within the approved color range for the neighborhood. I slowly turned to look at my car, a dark blue, modern sedan. Nothing fancy, nothing obnoxious. Just a car. Let me get this straight. You're telling me that my completely normal vehicle is somehow violating your ridiculous rules. She nodded, looking entirely serious. HOA guidelines state that cars parked in visible driveways must be neutral in color, white, gray, or black. Blue is not an approved shade. I ran a hand down my face. She gave me a tight smile. Not yet. That was the moment I realized Margaret wasn't just some pushy busybody. She was relentless. A few days later, I received another HOA violation letter. I would also be charged additional penalties for excessive driveway length and failure to maintain community standards. I actually laughed when I opened it. Margaret must have thought I was going to roll over and accept these fines. Instead, I did the one thing she clearly wasn't expecting. I fought back. First, I contacted a real estate attorney and explained the situation. He laughed at the sheer absurdity of it all and assured me that the HOA had no legal authority over my property. Next, I decided to have some fun at Margaret's expense. I bought the ugliest, most obnoxious lawn decorations I could find. A 10-foot inflatable flamingo, a set of brightly colored garden gnomes, each one weirder than the last, and a flashing LED sign that read not HOA property. Oh, you bet. Then I grabbed a lawn chair and waited. This is unacceptable. You're absolutely right. HOA rules do say that lawn decorations should be modest and tasteful. Her jaw clenched. You're being childish. Really? Because it seems like you're the one throwing a tantrum over my driveway. I shot back. She took a deep breath, visibly struggling to compose herself. You are making this harder than it needs to be. Oh, I'm just getting started, I said. Then they filed a complaint with the city, claiming my driveway was an unapproved expansion that needed to be demolished. Unfortunately for them, I had already done my homework. The next day, I saw Margaret outside, arguing with the city inspector. This property is not under your jurisdiction, but the neighborhood. But Margaret was like a cockroach in a power suit. She wasn't going down without a fight. That night, I got a new letter from the HOA. Now they were claiming that part of my driveway encroached on community land, and if I didn't remove it, they would tear it down themselves. That was it. I wasn't just dealing with a pushy HOA anymore. Margaret was trying to steal my land, and she had no idea what she had just started. Margaret stood among them, clipboard in hand, a smug grin plastered on her face. Correction, the part that technically extends to HOA land. I laughed. Since that's technically community property, we'll be making some adjustments. She shrugged. The board voted on it last night. I stared at her, barely believing the audacity. You're telling me that because you and a handful of busybodies voted, you now magically own part of my property? She gave me a sickly sweet smile. It's nothing personal. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Let's say, hypothetically, I don't let you touch my driveway. She feigned a sympathetic look. Oh, we'd hate for it to come to that. But in that case, the HOA will have no choice but to remove the encroaching portion ourselves. We have contractors on standby. I clenched my fists. You're trespassing. Not according to the HOA's new boundary regulations, she said. I stared at her, then at the workers who had already started marking the pavement for demolition. That was when I realized this wasn't just about my driveway. Margaret wanted to set a precedent, to prove that she could force me into the HOA by sheer persistence. If she got away with this, she wouldn't stop at my driveway. She'd start slapping me with fees, restrictions, and insane rules until I either caved in or sold my home. I wasn't about to let that happen. I turned on my heel and walked straight into my house. Margaret thought she had won. She had no idea that she had just started the biggest fight of her life. The counterattack begins. The first thing I did was call my real estate lawyer. Within hours, I had a certified surveyor on my property, marking the actual boundaries. Unsurprisingly, nothing from the HOA's revised map lined up with reality. The next day, my lawyer filed a cease and desist order against Margaret and the HOA, citing illegal encroachment, property fraud, and harassment. Then I went a step further. I installed motion-activated security cameras along my driveway. If anyone so much as breathed in the wrong direction near my property, I'd have proof. Finally, I put up my own sign, private property, trespassers will be prosecuted. The moment Margaret saw it, she practically sprinted to my house. This is ridiculous, she screeched. You're escalating this situation unnecessarily. I smiled. Oh, I'm escalating? You literally brought in a construction crew to demolish my property. She scoffed. This is just a misunderstanding. I folded my arms. Great. Then I'll see you in court. For the first time, Margaret hesitated. She knew she was in trouble. The HOA's last desperate move. Margaret must have realized she had bitten off more than she could chew because she didn't try to send in another crew. Instead, she changed tactics. The next morning, I received a formal HOA invoice. It was a bill for $10,000 in back HOA fees. Attached was a notice stating that I had been officially enrolled in the HOA. I laughed. They actually thought they could just force me in. I walked straight to Margaret's house and knocked. She answered with an infuriatingly smug expression. Oh, hello? I assume you got our notice. Yeah, I said, holding up the letter. There's just one problem. I never signed anything. She pursed her lips. Well, as I mentioned before, the board corrected the clerical error. Your home was always meant to be part of the HOA. The paperwork just. I cut her off. Yeah, see, that's fraud. She blinked. Excuse me. I stepped closer. You can't just invent a contract and claim I agreed to it. That's not how the law works. She scoffed. Well, you'll have to take that up with the board. Oh, don't worry. I already did. I pulled out my phone and pressed play. A recording of my lawyer's call with the county office played loud and clear, which confirms that the property located at address was never, at any point, part of the HOA. And any attempt to retroactively apply HOA regulations would be considered a fraudulent misrepresentation of contractual obligations. Margaret's face drained of color. I smirked. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to void this fake invoice. You're going to leave my property alone, and you're going to forget my name. Otherwise, my lawyer is filing a lawsuit against you and every board member involved in this scam." Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but she had nothing to say. She stormed back inside without another word. The humiliating fallout. By the next week, the HOA officially dropped all claims against my property. But the best part? A county official launched an investigation into the HOA's fraudulent activities. Turns out, I wasn't the only victim. Margaret and her cronies had been forging documents, rewriting property lines, and inventing fines for years. The county slammed them with multiple violations. The HOA was forced to pay thousands in fines. Several board members resigned in disgrace. And Margaret? She was removed as president. Even better, her own neighbors turned against her. The same people she had bullied and fined for years finally had their revenge. The ultimate payback. With Margaret dethroned and the HOA in chaos, I decided to have a little fun. I parked the biggest, ugliest, rusted-out RV I could find right in my driveway. Then I put up a brand-new sign, HOA-free zone. Enter at your own risk. The look on Margaret's face the next time she walked past my house. Priceless. I had one. And the best part? Margaret had no power left to do a damn thing about it. The final victory. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood finally returned to normal. And me? I made sure to leave a permanent reminder of my victory at the edge of my driveway. I put up a brand new sign, HOA-free zone. Trespassers will be publicly humiliated. It stood tall, right where Margaret had once tried to put her ridiculous community improvement project sign. Every time I walked past it, I smiled. Margaret had tried to steal my land. She had tried to force me into submission. But in the end, she lost everything. For the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't the one giving out the fines. She was the one paying them. Epilogue. The neighborhood reclaims its freedom. With Margaret out of the picture, the neighborhood flourished. People started decorating their homes however they wanted. One neighbor painted his mailbox bright neon green, just because Margaret would have hated it. Another parked an old camper in his driveway, something that had been banned under HOA rules. Someone else put up a giant inflatable dinosaur on their lawn, just because they could. It was like a neighborhood-wide rebellion. All the stupid restrictions Margaret had enforced for years were gone. And the best part? The neighborhood didn't fall apart without the HOA. It actually got better. Neighbors started talking to each other again, instead of being afraid of getting fined over some imaginary violation. People started helping each other out. One weekend, a group of us cleaned up the community park, the same one Margaret had spent years collecting beautification fees for, without ever actually using the money to improve it. With her gone, people actually wanted to pitch in. Turns out, nobody needed the HOA. We just needed freedom from Margaret's insanity. The final cherry on top. A few months later, I was out in my yard when my new neighbor, a great guy who had just moved into Margaret's old house, walked over with a grin. "You're not going to believe who I saw at the grocery store today," he said. I smirked. "Let me guess, Margaret?" He nodded. She was working as a cashier. Looked miserable. I let out a satisfied laugh. Guess that HOA pension plan didn't pan out, huh? And with that, the story came full circle. Margaret had tried to control everything. She had tried to bend an entire neighborhood to her will. And now, she was stuck scanning groceries for the same people she used to fine for aesthetic violations. I guess she finally learned that power doesn't mean a damn thing if nobody respects you. Somewhere deep down, she probably still believed she was in the right. But as I stood there, enjoying my peaceful HOA-free home, I realized something. It didn't matter what Margaret thought. Because at the end of the day, I won. And it felt glorious. If you've ever dealt with an insane HOA like this, drop your story in the comments below. Have you ever had a power-hungry HOA president try to control your life? How did you fight back? Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more wild HOA stories. And remember, never let an HOA Margaret push you around. Because at the end of the day, the best way to beat them is to make sure they never come back.